Thank you so very much, Ruby and Lee. It's a wonderful day to be together and talk about these important topics. My focus today is going to be on the pandemic and housing distressed children. Now, much attention has been given to high-risk individuals like the elderly or those who are immune compromised of how they contract the coronavirus and COVID-19. But children have been noticeably absent from this conversation. We are learning that the COVID virus is a very sneaky one, and that we are now only learning about the impacts that it has upon children. It is indicated that about 80% of the children in New York City have been infected with the virus, but most of them are asymptomatic. And the long-term problems, not just on their lungs, but on their heart, the rest of their organ systems, we're just now learning about. So we should not have them be absent from the conversation. Right, so we're in this presentation looking at how children in housing distress situations are especially vulnerable to catching the disease and then receiving adequate treatment if they get it. We're going to look at those who are homeless or in housing distress situations. We're going to look at the contributing factors to their homelessness and housing distress, their exposure to the virus, the identification of COVID, treatment of the virus, and then their chances of recovery. My presentation concludes that while there is a pandemic of the coronavirus, there's also a pandemic of insensitivity of the impact of poverty and dislocation on children. If children receive the care standards as outlined in the UN's Convention on the Rights of the Child, the epidemic of the virus would not attack them as heavily, and if it did, there would be adequate resources to assist in their identification, treatment, and recovery. Okay. We know that housing is a protective factor. If you have a house, you have a bed, you have a refrigerator where you could get something cool to drink, you have a stove where you could cook some hot soup. We know that you have a lot of control of your life if you have a house. But what happens if you don't? All right, if you do not have a regular, stable housing, you are at risk of catching this virus, as well as a variety of other negative factors, right? So when you live with other people, you have no control over who comes and who goes, what their schedules are like, how much noise they make, what time you can get to bed, if they're going to wake you up, if you are going to have access to the bathroom, if you can cook. Right. So congregate living in general is a high risk factor. When we look at homelessness, we know that there are many different types. We are looking at those who are living on the street. We're looking at those who are doubled up with others. We're looking at those who are couch surfers. We are looking at those who are living in campgrounds or in locations that are inhospitable in normal situations, living in their vehicle, and so on. People who are living in shelters are vulnerable because you have a lot of rules, regulations on people coming and going where you have no control. People who are the travelers are at risk. Those on the street, we need to look at the youth situations of those who are in residential facilities. Sometimes these are for special needs, or they could be for educational purposes, substance abuse, mental health issues. It could be that they are in detainment centers or in jails. When we look at the problems faced by refugees, asylum seekers, immigrants, and children and youth who are crossing the border, they are at terrible risk, especially if they are unaccompanied, where they have no adult to advocate for them. They fall in the cracks and often do not receive the care. And in many ways, they lay a low profile so that the governments and organizations won't put them at other kinds of legal risk. We know you have displacement of children who run away due to war, who are isolated, their parents are dying. We have displacement due to natural environmental disasters like hurricanes, fires, tsunamis, and so on. So there's many different reasons for why children are in housing distress besides homelessness itself. If we look at frank homelessness, we know that it is a combination of a variety of social factors. You have poverty in general, and this is related to your income, your housing, your money in, the money that you have to spend to go out, the food that you have. We're looking at issues of the lack of political and social will and how these impact family issues, health issues, certainly education, as we are focusing on today. As we've pointed out earlier in this event, you've got all kinds of trauma affecting a variety of children, and teachers have to deal with that. So you've got physical issues, you've got social, economic, political, emotional issues all combining. Sometimes we hear leaders say, well, we'll just give them a roof over their head, then all of the homelessness will go away. And that is so far from true to be ludicrous. We have a variety of factors that we need to be addressing when we look at the eradication of homelessness and housing distress. When we look particularly at COVID and homelessness, we know that children who are homeless are at high risk of being able to prevent the exposure to the illness to begin with, because of all the people that they have to associate with and the irregularity of them not having stable housing where they can go and be safe. Epidemiology, we know with comorbidity being high between poverty, housing distress, and illness of all kinds. Homeless children in general have major respiratory problems, and since COVID often hits the lungs, they are at more risk than perhaps other children. We see during the COVID situation high unemployment of their parents, and we see them having greater chances of bankruptcy, evictions, and the loss of their homes. People are doubled up with others, and this is a very delicate situation, especially one where we have slow economic recovery. In my nation, we have had places open too fast, and people who were not working and then got their jobs back are finding that they are losing their jobs again. So how long the economic recovery is going to last, anyone knows. Data indicates that by the end of this summer, we will have a 45% increase in the US of homelessness to over 800,000. And that's only the people that they're counting. And the organizations typically count adults. They are not counting children. They're not counting youth. They're not counting those who are too little to be identified by organizations like schools, and those who have fallen between the cracks. If we look at the rise of hunger, data indicates from this past week that we have 14 million children in June of this year suffering from hunger, all right, in the US. And this is 10 million more than in 2018. If you are hungry, you're not getting the proper nutrition, you don't have a bed to sleep in and a home where you're safe. All of these factors together are putting children who are in housing distress at terrible risk of getting the virus and having long-term problems. We can anticipate the increase of more collective living. We know that health insurance is important, and if you are in the US in particular, there's no universal health care, and if you've lost your health care related to your job, or if the government's going to cut the Affordable Care Act, then people who are at terrible risk are not going to have money for any kind of health care. And they don't have the discretionary money in their pockets to pay for medications and other resources. As schools have had to close in order to keep everyone safe, homeless children have lost a lifeline. Schools are a social service agency in many ways, aren't they? So when you talk about reimagining education, looking at the important role that they play for not just education, but for physical, social, and mental health services is critically important. And so kids are losing their meals, they're losing their resources, their identification of people who can help them. If we look at the trajectory of child illness interventions, if you're homeless or in housing distress, identifying the illness that children may have in the first place may be hard. We know that children get runny noses, they get coughs, they get fevers just routinely. When is it COVID and when is it a self-limiting illness that will go away on its own? We don't know. And if you are stressed and you're trying to scramble to find a place where you're going to live and sleep that night, it makes the identification harder. So when are you going to go take that child to the doctor? Because that has a set of ripple out repercussions. Can you get an appointment in the first place? Many doctors are not taking new patients. They have waiting lists. You have to be critically ill for them to see you. And so what about the ones where you're not quite sure if they have it or not? Getting a test has been almost impossible for many adults and healthcare providers, and children in general are not getting the test to even find out if they have the dis-ease. There's logistics of getting an appointment. And so can you get there? If you've got a sick child and you're relying on mass transportation, taking a sick child on the bus, on the subway, on the train, trying to walk them, get them to the appointment, can all be very challenging. And then can you afford it? And can you afford the medications or the other resources that they say that you have to have? Some of the children will be hospitalized, but typically only those who are in dire straits, which puts many of the children who are sick being sent home. And if you don't have a home and you don't have the resources, then it makes your chances of recovery very compromised. So we have to ask, where's our community's social commitment to the prevention of the disease for children in the first order, for identifying it among them, making sure that they have access to adequate, appropriate treatment, and giving them the resources that they need in order to recover. We need to look at this from a broad point of view. And how are we going to make these resources available? How are we going to make the services available? If we are in lockdown, many places may not even be taking people, or if we're looking at online contact, what if you are not having access to the digital ability to do it? We need to look at how we are creating community partnerships, and certainly looking at how we are going to redesign schools to promote comprehensive well-being. We know that as unemployment increases and the loss of wages goes down, the loss of health insurance or your discretionary money to pay for health care. We know that food costs are going up, and even food availability of certain products very hard to find. This is an indication that we can logically anticipate an increase of homelessness and housing distress for children. And as Andy pointed out, we need to be looking at how we are going to invest in the early years, because that is foundational to what is going to happen for children's physical, emotional, social well-being for the rest of their lives. And we as communities cannot survive unless we have strong children who will become strong adults. We need to make children's best interest a priority in every community, in every service, and every funding decision that we make. This is ordered in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. So it is obvious that young lives matter. So I think that we need to, as child advocates, ask, where is the social outcry to support their access to housing, healthcare, and education? We need to be their voice. And I hope that you will join me and the millions of others who are in support of children's rights. I have some articles on children, COVID, and housing distress that we can make available to you, you can email me, and you can always visit my website at yvonnevissing.com. Thank you very much for this opportunity.